All right, so during class we talked about doing a little refresher on how to deal with solving by square roots, because a couple of you were a little confused as to what to do. So when we're solving by square roots, what we said was that it's important to recognize there's going to be two separate solutions, because if I take the square root of a number, I could be getting two numbers that are exactly the same that are positive, or I could be getting two numbers that are exactly the same but are negative. So you'll end up with two answers for the most part. There will be some special cases where we'll talk about it where you could end up with just a single answer, but those will come a little bit later. Now, it's not always going to be the case where it's plus or minus the same number. Sometimes it will be, but not always. So just be aware that it could look like this, or it could be two completely different numbers. And they don't necessarily need to be positive and negative. It could be like +4 and +7. So it's not always a positive number and not always a negative number. It could be a mix. All right, so solving by square roots is really just following your order of operations, kind of in reverse, because when we're solving, we have to go in reverse. So I would just go through this and start just like any other problem. So square root both sides, I would end up with x is the square root of 25, but like we said, it could be a positive or a negative, which in this case would leave us with 5 and -5. As we start to make these problems more complicated, it's important to recognize what order these things are in. So I could be dealing with a multiplying situation. I could be before I have to get rid of the exponents. Like in this case, I'm multiplying by 2 and squaring. So multiplication would have to be dealt with first. So I divide, end up with x squared is 16, and then I could take my square root. X is +4 and x is -4. Now, like I said, as the problems get more complicated, it's important to keep track of your order so you know what's going on. So in this case, I have some subtraction going on. I would need to get rid of that first. So I would add 4 to both sides, end up with 3x squared equals 27 before I could get rid of the multiplying by dividing and then taking the square root. Now, whenever we start to deal with multiplying or dividing with a negative number, it's important to kind of keep your eye on that, because like we said in class, when you're dealing with negatives, things start to get a little weird. So first, get rid of my adding and subtracting. I end up with -1/2 x squared. Then I'm going to get rid of my dividing. But when I do that, I divide by this -1/2, I end up with a +4, which means that I'm back to a normal situation like I was over here. So I know I'm doing this right, and I'm going to get two real solutions. But what we talked about in class was, what if we have a situation where it looks something like x squared plus 16 equals 0, and you start to solve this by subtracting the 16 to the other side, and you end up with a negative over here. So if you ever end up with a situation where you have something squared equals a negative number, your answer for now will be no real solution, because there's no way for us to take the square root of a negative number. In order to get a negative number, what we talked about is that you would need to multiply a positive and a negative number together. You can't do that in a square root because we need two of the exact same numbers, so this isn't even an option. So we have no real solution if I have something squared equals a negative number. Now, eventually, sometime next week, we'll talk about those imaginary numbers, and then those will kind of deal with this whole situation. All right. What happens when we start adding in parentheses to the whole problem? Well, in our order of operations, parentheses are the last thing we deal with. So I can't get rid of anything until I get rid of everything outside of the parentheses first. So order of operations here would mean I have to get rid of the squared before I can get rid of the parentheses. So I square root, and I end up with, square root of this, positive or -5. But I need to split that out into two situations, because this is still an equation set up to two possible answers. So it would need to be x minus 1 could be +5, or x minus 1 could be -5. So then I can go through and solve by adding 1. So over here I end up with a 6, but over here I end up with a -4, because when I add 1 to a -5, I get a different answer. So this is a case where the numbers are not the same. You will find this most frequently when you're dealing with parentheses. So whenever I have parentheses going on, chances are I'm going to end up with two numbers that are not the same. So same thing over here. Following my order of operations, the exponent would have to go first. So I'd end up with x plus 3 equals positive or negative 9. Set up my two equations, my two scenarios. So x plus 3 could be 9, or x plus 3 could be negative 9. I'd subtract 3 from both sides, and then x could be 6, or x could be negative 12.